After Boris Johnson announced new COVID restrictions at the start of the week, the pressure was on Rishi Sunak to come up with the goods to protect millions of jobs. Yet his lacklustre job support scheme announced on Thursday does no such thing. Is the shine about to come off Dishy Rishi? And how deep an economic crisis do we face as the furlough scheme elapses? We'll also talk about COVID chaos on campuses in Scotland, with hundreds testing positive and even more in isolation. Why casual sex in the UK is still banned, and what it tells us about Starmer's Labour that Nadia Whittome was sacked for opposing torture or opposing the legalising of torture. Before we go on to our first story, you know the score. Share the stream, tweet on the hashtag TyskySour, like the show, all of those. You know what you need to do. With new coronavirus restrictions introduced at the start of this week, the government were under extreme pressure to come up with either an extension to or a replacement of the furlough scheme. That's due to expire at the end of October. In the end, Sunak has decided to replace the job retention scheme. That's what the furlough is. It's the official title of the furlough, with the job support scheme. So the latter will only support those who are working at least 1/3 of their usual hours, so as not to protect, in Sunak's words, unviable employment. We can take a look at the Chancellor make the announcement in the House of Commons.
I'm announcing today the new Jobs Support Scheme. The government will directly support the wages of people in work, giving businesses who face depressed demand the option of keeping employees in a job on shorter hours rather than making them redundant. The Job Support Scheme is built on 3 principles. First, it will support viable jobs. To make sure of that, employees must work at least 1/3 of their normal hours and be paid for that work as normal by their employer. The government, together with employers, will then increase those people's wages, covering 2/3 of the pay they have lost by reducing their working hours. And the employee will keep their job.
Now, I'm going to attempt to explain to you what the job support scheme is. It's very technical. For most of the hours after he'd announced that, I was just hearing it in the background on the radio and in TV. And I have to admit, before I actually sat down and looked at it properly, I didn't get it, but I'm going to do my best. So the theory is that because we still have massively reduced demand, but the economy isn't completely closed down, the idea is that businesses should still be able to function, but for obvious reasons, they won't be able to function at full capacity. The policy was briefed to newspapers as allowing employers to keep on workers, but for lower hours, whilst the government subsidised them for the hours that they did not work. Now, let's look at how it will work in practice. So that was the theory. So to be included on the scheme, employees will need to work 1/3 of their usual hours. The employer will pay the full salary for those hours worked. And for the hours not worked, so this is the significant bit, the government will pay 1/3 of the salary, the employer will pay 1/3 of the salary, and the rest will be a hit taken by the employee. So the employee will get a third less income for the hours that they have not worked. If you're a little bit confused, we've got a graphic up for you. So this is borrowed from the Daily Mail, which we don't do very often, but I thought it was quite a good one. So as you can see here, we're looking at someone who is only working 33% of their usual hours. The 33% is paid for by their employer, represented in blue. And then the other sections of the pie chart is the hours not worked, 1/3 of which is paid for by the employer, 1/3 of which is paid for by the Treasury, and 1/3 of which is unpaid. All this means that for a worker who works 1/3 of their hours, the employer will pay 55% of their usual full-time salary. The government will pay 22% of their usual salary, and the worker will lose out 23% of their usual full-time salary. So that's pretty similar to the original furlough from the worker's perspective. But it's only similar to the workers, to the perspective of the worker, to the furlough. Sorry, it's only similar to the furlough from the perspective of the worker if they keep their job. And that's where the problem comes in, because it doesn't look like this system, as it is constituted, will incentivize employers to keep people in their employ. And this is quite technical. So here I'm going to give you an example. So imagine you are an employer with 3 employees and your demand has been cut by 1/3. Quite a realistic assumption. Many businesses' demands have been, or the demand of their goods have been cut by 1/3. Now you've got 2 options. So either sign up to this scheme, you employ all 3 of them for 1/3 of their usual hours, and then you pay for a third of the hours that aren't worked. Or you sack two of them, you keep one, and you just pay them for the hours worked. Now, in one of those scenarios, you don't have to pay for any hours not worked. In one of those scenarios, you do have to pay for hours not worked. But in both of them, the same amount is produced. So you can see that the cold, hard logic of capitalism suggests that you aren't going to sign up to this scheme, and what you are going to do is just make more people unemployed. So it doesn't seem to be working on the fundamental level of what it was billed to do, which was to incentivize bosses to, instead of laying off people, just get them to work fewer hours. So it doesn't look like in any way that it is up to the job of the, I worked out how to pronounce it before we went live, the Kurzarbeit scheme. So that's the German short hours scheme. The German version, they subsidize the full hours that aren't worked. So as an employer, in that previous example, if you had 3 employees, you could put them all down to a third. You'd only pay a third of their wages and the government would come in to pay the rest. So why have the government not done this? Can we get Aaron in yet? No, we can't? No problem. Well, I was speaking to James Medway earlier today, wonk extraordinaire, and his suggestion was that maybe this was to try and segment the population. So you've got insiders and outsiders. It looks like businesses will be more likely to keep people in their employ if they are skilled workers, people who they're quite worried about losing, or people who they'd have to pay big redundancy packages for if they lost them. So in the simple maths analysis I gave you at the beginning, the cheapest thing to do is fire 2 of the workers because it's not that costly to fire 2 of the workers. That might be the case if you're in the hospitality sector. It's less likely to be the case if you are a car manufacturer, for example, and you have people who have proper good contracts, and who you would have to negotiate a good deal if you were to lose them. So what is the alternative? This was put quite well by Torsten Bell at the Resolution Foundation. So he put forward, what does seem to me just like a sort of sensible, rational option. So he writes, this could all be fixed and without spending more money by scrapping the 7.5 billion job retention bonus that literally no one thinks is a good policy, and reducing the employer cost of the JSS hugely, transforming firms' incentive to save jobs. We really should do it. So he's saying instead of giving every firm 100 or 1,000 quid, it was, wasn't it, for every worker they bring off the furlough, which, as the Labour Party argued, to be fair to them, waste loads of money because there are loads of people who would have brought those workers back anyway without that £1,000. You should just make this short hours scheme an actual short hours scheme, which is to say that employers shouldn't really have to pay any of the hours that aren't being worked. That means they will have the incentive to keep on workers and we can avoid mass unemployment. At the moment, we are heading straight into mass unemployment. I've got a new clip for you. This is from the chief executive of NEC. So he is giving a very dark prognosis about the future of the retail sector.
A lot of people say with this permanent looking shift online, a lot of the unviable jobs are in retail. Is that right?
I think that is right, yes. And I wouldn't want to underestimate the difficulty that is going to cause a lot of people who work in retail. I think it's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people. We will inevitably, and have already, reduced the number of people working in our shops, and I expect that to continue over the coming 5 or 6 years as the demand for retail goes down. But we're taking on people in our call centre. We're training new recruits in our call centres, in our warehousing. Our distribution networks are taking on new employees. So there are new jobs, and in terms of finding where those opportunities are, the internet provides an amazingly powerful tool to connect employers with employees.
So the chief executive of NEC saying that these jobs aren't going to be coming back anytime soon. In a way, he's kind of almost supporting the Rishi Sunak line because he's saying this is going to be long term. We don't want to save jobs that aren't unviable. And he's clearly suggesting there that many jobs in retail are going to be unviable for 5 or 6 years. He is a Tory peer, so he does have some incentive to give proclamations which do back up conservative policy. Many people might argue that in many sectors of the economy, this idea that we are already calling certain jobs unviable while we're in the middle of a lockdown seems a little bit premature. So, for example, many bars at the moment are not going to be employing their staff for more than a third of their hours, and it's quite cheap to sack people. I doubt there are going to be many nightclubs or bars who are using this particular scheme, but those employment or those employers, those businesses could all be thoroughly viable when we have a vaccine and when people are going out again. So it seems to me like this is condemning jobs which could quite possibly bounce back in a perfectly sustainable manner. What we really should be arguing for, though, is proper unemployment benefit, because I mean, obviously, I think you should save jobs, but the main thing that we should be demanding of this government over the long term is that if you lose your job, it is not being condemned to a shit quality of life and being condemned to being bullied by the state to constantly look for a job even when there aren't any. What we need is good, proper unemployment benefits, which doesn't blame the unemployed and which gives them enough money to work in or to live in dignity, which at the moment does not happen whatsoever. And I mean, probably the only good thing that can possibly come out of the oncoming economic crisis is if some middle class people go on universal credit and realize that actually it is an appalling amount of money to live on. And hopefully that will undermine some of the scare stories we constantly hear about people living a life of luxury on benefits. That does not happen. That does not exist in this country. And it would make sense, actually, for the Conservatives to be trying to save only those jobs of people who usually vote Conservative, because if they find out how shit universal credit is, they might not be voting for them in 2024. We're going to go on to our next story, which is a wild one and a very predictable policy failure. Before we do that, if you're new to this show, do hit the subscribe button and do hit the notifications button. This week, Scottish students have been banned from meeting with anyone outside their households, and just for this weekend, from going to any bars or pubs. Pretty brutal. This follows an outbreak of at least 172 confirmed coronavirus cases at the University of Glasgow, which has forced 600 students into self-isolation. We can take a look at the BBC report with some quarantined students describing their experience.
I heard of like a couple of cases across like our accommodation, and then it was me tested positive, like a few others in our flat, and like now I don't even know of any flats that don't really have positive cases. I think pretty much, well, obviously everyone's isolated now, but it's kind of scary, especially because some people have worse symptoms than others, and no one has exactly the same symptoms even in our flat, so it's very worrying that you might end up developing the worst ones rather than just the kind of more mild ones. We're really lucky because we're in a big flat, so we've got lots of people to talk to. But we've been stuck for maybe 5 days now. It's weird. So it's kind of really kind of hitting us that we are in here for 2 weeks. I think we're just like, oh, what it is. Because to be honest, we don't know any different. Like, we don't know what uni life is really supposed to be like because we've not really experienced that. I mean, we know it's not meant to be like this, but we've not like experienced how it's meant to be. And like our whole freshers, we pretty much just had to socialise with our flat because we couldn't go out and meet other people. We couldn't go out to clubs or anything. So it is kind of just quite similar to what happened before. We just can't go to the shops.
Now, what is going on here, right? So this was completely foreseeable. Everyone knew that telling people to go back to universities, to go back and live on campuses with a bunch of people they hadn't met before, and tell them you're not allowed to have parties, you're not allowed to meet people outside of your house. Everyone knew that was impossible, implausible. That was never going to happen. The UCU, so the Lecturers Union, was saying that. They were saying we need to make learning from home the default setting, the default option, because if we push people back into campuses, this is what's going to happen. You're going to get a hotbed of coronavirus, which, although many students are sort of in the safer age bracket when it comes to coronavirus, they're not likely to get taken into ICU. They might get long COVID. It might not be a pleasant experience, but they're unlikely to be added to the death statistics. Even though that's the case, there are many people who work in universities, cleaners, lecturers, etc., who are. And it's putting them in unnecessary risk to put these people back into student halls, or for the first time, put them into student halls. You also have an issue, which is that these are people moving from all over the country, going into basically a petri dish for coronavirus, and then going out into the city, going out into towns, and that is going to be a breeding ground, really, for coronavirus to spread to more vulnerable parts of the population. And this, it seems to me, is the problem which banning students from pubs and banning students from bars is supposed to solve. The idea seems to be to put all of these students in student halls, a bit like the cruise ships at the beginning of this crisis, when you had sort of a coronavirus outbreak on, unfortunately then it was with precisely the age group who are most vulnerable to coronavirus. Now at least it's young people. But this idea that you put them all in this enclosed space, they all get the disease, maybe some kind of herd immunity, and if you hermetically seal the boundaries of that, it will never get out. The problem is, well, one, that's not particularly fair. They didn't advertise that to the students when they said, if you go back to your halls, you won't be able to leave anymore. because then you'll be like a biological weapon. They didn't say that to them before they moved in. They moved them in saying it's COVID secure, like everything else in this society is apparently COVID secure, even though that doesn't really mean anything. And then they sprung it on them that, oh, wait, you're not allowed to leave. Maybe it's because you had a party you weren't supposed to have. It doesn't seem particularly fair to me. Why is it happening? Money. Like so many of the explanations we give you on this show, this is because someone profits from students going back to their halls, notably the universities. So universities in the sort of defunct system which we currently have at the moment make loads of their income basically from rent which students pay to live in their halls. I think universities considered doing remote learning. They considered the fact that ultimately, from an educational perspective, it would be just as good as people coming into the university. It seems perfectly plausible. And also, these students are all going to be doing remote learning now anyway. There's no one going to class in Glasgow or any of these Scottish universities. By the way, it's in Scottish universities because they go back to university first. It's nothing particularly problematic about the Scottish policy compared to Britain's. But they need them to pay rent. So they told them, come to university, it'll all be fine. When they got there, they said, oh, actually, you had some parties. Now we're going to have to lock you in. I think we might have Aaron Bastani now, who was today, I think, sort of filming about the collapse of the high streets, but now I'm going to get him to talk about universities.
I was in Portsmouth today and Bournemouth. We were recording two places, two university cities. And what's interesting is a lot of post-industrial places and lots of parts of the economy in this country are really screwed. But you can see how students have really kept a lot of places kind of ticking over for the last 10, 15 years, particularly after the global financial crisis. Talking to my dad today, for instance, in Bournemouth, he says there's about 22,000 students there. On average, you're looking at about £5,000 stipend from the government. Just that. Forget any money from the bank of mum and dad. Forget any business they might be doing, or any cheap sort of labour they're providing for the local labour market. That in and of itself is a stimulus for around £100 million a year. And students not going back to universities for many of these places is a knockout blow. You're looking at a good 15-20% of overall demand. And so you can understand the economic impetus generally about why you'd want these students back in consuming things in the local economy. But it was always crazy. That was never actually going to be a thing. I
mean, because they're not consuming anything in the local economy because they're all locked in their halls.
Precisely. And what you've done is you've effectively created a mass public health risk for local communities because you've said, like you said, it's the equivalent of a biological weapon. You've got 1,000 people in this giant block. Occasionally people will be coming and going. It may potentially overwhelm hospitals if this does progress to be the kind of problem it could potentially be. We're seeing it in Glasgow. And I don't think it'll be isolated. I just think this feels like they've just done a huge experiment in social living and young people who aren't going to be particularly good. I'm sure they will be pretty good, but generally speaking, we know that, teenagers and people in their early 20s aren't the best at adhering to social guidelines, for instance, around how tactile you can be. They're not going to be as responsible as people in their 30s and 40s. We've got to acknowledge that. And so to put thousands of people in these buildings in the way that they've done, it's crazy. It's crazy. And I think first and foremost, it was actually about saving rentiers. And you said money. I don't think it's just money because you could make the argument, well, it's local shops, local taxi drivers, yada, yada, yada. Okay, that's true. But I think the fact that you've said, no, they have to go to halls of residence, I think it's propping up a specific part of the economy in this country, which, it determines so much of the political debate. We have an economy based on whether or not the value of somebody's property assets and commercial office portfolios should devalue or not, or whether Unite student housing are going to see their share price fall, or whether some major multi-billion-pound house builder is going to be hit by the fact that house prices might stay the same for 18 months, heaven forbid. And that is the thing that's guiding the government on this. It's not actually GDP growth even. It's really strange how we've got this tiny fragment of the sort of capitalist interest, which has overwhelming influence in terms of what we do. And we always knew that, but I think this story in particular about student accommodation is an amazing crystallization of it.
Well, it's a crystallization of something else as well, because often when we talked about, the drive to send people back into their offices, we talked about commercial landlords as if they were a distinct class of people who the government was seeking to protect. And I think in many ways that is true. But when you get to students in universities, you're right. Some of these are, private companies who provide halls, such as Unite Students. Is that what it's called? So obviously, no relation to the trade union. But it's also that the financial model of universities themselves is dependent on this rental income. So we've sort of created a system whereby for universities and for institutions that are, we would agree, are essential for the functioning of society. Commercial landlords, not essential for the functioning of society. Universities, yes. But we have made universities dependent on rental income for them to continue, for them to survive, which is why I think the bosses of those institutions have made this decision to pressure students back in. And I mean, basically trick them to come back in, because they did tell, students, you have to come in. You can't just do this course from your home. The reason was financial, but they didn't say there's going to be a high chance that in the first week of coming here, you're going to, one, get locked in your student halls for 2 weeks, and two, for the rest of your term, all of your education is going to be online. Because I think in the Scottish universities, they have announced that now. They have in many of the American universities, they try to do in-person education for like a week. Then everyone gets coronavirus. They're like, no, of course it will all be on Zoom. So you've traveled half the country, then you're paying loads of money to live in some shoddy halls, which you're now locked inside. And the only contact you're having with a teacher or a lecturer is on Zoom. And of course, the contact you should have with your teacher or lecturer is on Zoom, because we don't want the lecturers to be dying of coronavirus. But the fact that you weren't honest, that these universities weren't honest about that to their students before they came in, just seems fundamentally dishonest to me.
Can I come in on that? I mean, also, I obviously the young people are the victims here, Michael. But tell me, if you were 18, 19, 20, would you have gone to a halls of residence this year? I mean, who's advising these young people? It's like going to buy a car and none of the wheels are there, and 2 of the seats are missing, and all the seatbelts don't work, and the indicators, are wired the wrong way.
But you've got to remember what the alternative is, right? So the alternative is you're 18, you're excited about leaving your parents' house, or maybe your parents' house, doesn't have that much space, right? And so either you can defer, you can take a gap year, which is, financially difficult. The job market isn't exactly great at the moment. So you're going to have some savings, or borrow some money off your parents or whatever to sort of make that function for you. So you've got an option of either you take the student loan, you go to university, you pay your rental income at the halls, you sort of cross your fingers and hope for the best, or you have a year where you're sort of rudderless because it's impossible to get a job. Maybe you're home, you don't want to start university from your bedroom in your parents' house because do you know what I mean?
You go to, I'm not saying you don't go to university. I'm saying, why the hell would you go to halls of residence?
Well, because that's if you're 18 or 19, it's difficult to go find yourself a house. But the whole reason we have halls of residence is because that's where you go to meet, the friends that you're going to have for the rest of the degree.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I was 18,
maybe it was a while ago. You've forgotten how this all works, Aaron.
No, you're very enthusiastic. The point is, you can go do that next year. I mean, I don't see.
But then you have to take a gap year. That's what I'm saying. There's financial difficulties for taking a gap year.
You could be in halls in your second year or whatever. If that's what you want to do, I'm just saying, like, you could. It just seems. It seems. What are you paying? I mean, I wouldn't do a degree at all if these were the conditions. I mean, again, I'm not blaming the young people themselves. Maurizio Lazzarato talks about the making of, financialized man. And one of the primary aspects of contemporary higher education is about creating a debtor subject who's very comfortable being in debt, who never thinks they're going to actually be in the blue, who won't own assets, who's permanently in kind of debt servitude. So that's I think it's a great argument. One of the great reasons why they love the expansion of higher education in the 21st century is it cultivates the subject of the debtor. And like you're seeing this just go on into warp speed, because basically it's saying we're now going to create this subject, which is like, yeah, you're going to pay money for literally the worst possible experience, and you're going to be paying for a qualification, which you could, the quality of it, you could basically get free online or from Coursera. I mean, it's just ripping away so many layers of, like, as you sort of, insinuated, it's ripping so many layers away from, like, what's university actually for? It's actually to teach people to better understand the world, to be happier, to be more productive, to be able to add value to other people's lives. That isn't what higher education is today. Higher education is every year we have this huge cohort of people. They take out debt. has a certain rate of interest. How much money can I make? Oh, I'm a student housing company. How big is that market? How much can we screw them? Oh, I'm UCL. I'm one of the senior management there. And by the way, this is another thing. All of these senior management people in places like UCL, LSE, Oxford, Cambridge, they all talk a big game. We're senior management. We've earned our £400,000. There's no industry out there where you can earn £400,000 and not have a contingency plan after something goes belly up after 1 week. How are these people worth £400,000 if in the context of COVID, they didn't have a plan B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way through to Z, given what's happening? How do they legitimize that kind of salary? Management material, Michael, is what I'm asking you.
Yeah, well, I mean, they've probably done, as I say, I think they've probably done their job, because all they needed to do was get the kids into the halls to pay the rent. So it is much better for them to only make the lessons online once they're already living in halls, because if they announced beforehand they were making the lessons online, no one would have come in and they would have, gone bust. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying I think that's the logic. I don't think this was a cock-up, but rather a conspiracy. Let's go on to our next story. Before we do that, Sam Fletcher has a super chat of £23.23. Hi, Michael. Please could you wish my girlfriend Julia a very happy birthday for yesterday? Happy birthday, Julia, for yesterday. We're big fans of the show and love watching together. Thanks so much for all you do. Thank you for watching. And yes, happy birthday, Julia. The next story might be appropriate for you. I don't know if you are in a bubble or in the same household, or maybe you got good news at the start of the week. We'll go on to that in one moment. First of all, hit the like button. It's good for our self-esteem. Especially today's been quite chaotic, I have to say. New announcements from the government this week had the effect of increasing social distancing restrictions. However, in one respect, it gave us more freedoms. Previously, sex was only permitted between people in the same household or in a single coronavirus bubble. Now, however, official government guidelines state you are allowed to get busy with anyone with whom you are in an established relationship. It's that word, established relationship, which has appeared in the official government guidelines. Slightly ambiguous what that means. It was an ambiguity which Kay Burley on Sky on Thursday morning tried to get clarification from the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. What ensues now is 2 minutes of very cringeworthy television.
How long is this casual sex ban going to last? You're saying that no social distancing needed in established relationships. What about people who are not in an established relationship? Why am I whispering? I don't know.
I don't know. You're live on national TV.
Indeed.
Look, there are.
It's okay to smile.
In these rules that we have to bring in, you have to have there have to be boundaries to coin a phrase. That we have to. If you're saying that the two households shouldn't mix, which we are in some parts of the country, in the northeast, the northwest, in Scotland, in parts of Wales, then you have to then define what is the boundary of that, and that does lead to some.
That's my question. I mean, established relationship. Does that mean if I say I love you? Because some people say that and they don't mean it. But are you in an established relationship then? I don't know.
I think we should stick to the letter of it, which is that it's okay in an established relationship.
And what does that mean to you? I mean, I know what it means to you and Mrs. Hancock.
That was exactly how I was going to answer.
Yeah.
I know that I'm in an established relationship.
Okay. What about other people watching this morning? How would you define an established relationship?
I think it just means that people need to be careful, right? People need to be sensible. And if you're in a relationship that is well established, that's what it means.
6 months?
What it means is people realising that by coming into close contact with people in other households, then that is how the virus spreads. And I just come back to the first principles, right? Which is we all want to keep this virus under control. We all need to play our part. And playing our part involves following the social distancing rules and, from today, downloading the app. That is part of doing your bit. And it means abiding by these rules in their letter and their spirit. And if we all do that, then we'll get through this as best we possibly can. And you've body swerved the established relationship, haven't you? Because you don't really know what that means. Anybody can bend the rules on that, can't they? I wouldn't suggest that. I wouldn't suggest bending the rules. I would suggest sticking to them letter and spirit.
It was a very cringeworthy clip, but it is an undiscussed area. So as I said before, this is actually a loosening of the measures that the official guidelines now say that you can forget about social distancing measures if you are with someone with whom you are in an established relationship with. Before that, unless you lived with the person or you were with a bubble with them, that was not allowed. And I think the idea of, personally, I thought a bubble was a bit less restrictive than it had been, but I looked it up before we went live. To be in a bubble, the only groups who are allowed to form a bubble are people who live alone in a single adult household or single parents who shared custody of an under 18. Or you can form a bubble if you're in a multiple occupancy adult household. You can form a bubble with someone, but they have to be in a one-person household. So if you're in a house share, there better be only one of you who has a partner, or all of your partners have to live in the same house, which is a interesting situation. Aaron, what do you make of this? I feel like there are some sort of areas where, everyone's just clearly breaking the rules on this one. I think there are many people who are a stickler for the rules when it comes to coronavirus, but aren't going to have a year being abstinent because they've looked at the small print in the government guidelines and discovered that having sex is disallowed.
Yeah, I think it's a really simple thing. So I think in terms of your public conduct, I think people are being sort of very wise about public conduct because people can discern what you're doing. I think in terms of private conduct, people can't see what you're doing, and of course, trying to enforce private conduct is close to impossible. So you're absolutely right. I think people are being, in many ways, over diligent, over judicious in terms of public conduct, like remote working, like avoiding shopping. That's why we had help
not
out
over
to eat
judicious,
out.
though, because it's good, right? They're being sufficiently
some people are.
judicious.
No, from the perspective of the government, people are being more judicious than they expected. And then, and in terms of private conduct, that won't be the case. And I think that's to be expected. But the idea that the government can police, the idea that the government can police sort of private relations of people, A, it can't do that. B, it shouldn't do that. Ultimately, you can't have enforcement mechanisms telling people to not have sex with one another. What kind of society operates like that? Even if it was in the public interest, I think we generally agree that you wouldn't want to bestow that kind of authority onto the state.
So there have been some public authorities who have been more liberal or at least less prudish than our one. There's been a bunch of examples of these throughout the year, but the best one is clearly from New York City Council. Earlier in the year, they released the following as part of their guidelines for safer COVID sex. They advised people that if you're going to have sex with strangers, make it a little kinky. Be creative with sexual positions and physical barriers like walls that allow sexual contact while preventing close face-to-face contact. Aaron, what's your analysis as to why Sadiq Khan and the London Mayor's Office have not released similar guidelines encouraging everyone to use glory holes?
This is silly. This is a silly story. I just think the whole point of politics is about public relations. We can't police people's sexual conduct. It's ridiculous. Not even the most authoritarian states thought they could do that. Hitler and Stalin didn't think they could do that. Ultimately, it's about to what extent will people as individuals adhere to those rules. Some will, many won't, right? And that's just a fact. Many won't. And so fundamentally, as a society, as a public health sort of strategy, you can't rely on that stuff. And if you are relying on that stuff, that tells you we have deep, deep problems. And we've said it many times in the show, this is a condition which has 40% asymptomatic nature, long-term incubation rates. People, might be thinking, I'm fine, I'm totally, I feel fantastic. And they may well do. That's not them being in any way deceiving. But then they would give it to somebody else. And I honestly, as I said, I think on Monday, all of this without test and trace is pissing in the wind. All of it. And we'll see. We've seen the average daily number of cases, I think, double in the last 7 days. If it doubles again, we'll know. If we're talking again this time next week and it's daily number of new cases is doubling once more. But it all seems to me like pissing in the wind because, as we've said so many times, it's a very unique condition. This is not like Ebola or the common flu where, you're pretty much sick immediately. Ebola has a 50% fatality rate, but it also has a 50% fatality rate, pretty much as soon as somebody's got it. This is very, very different. It still feels to me like public measures like this are just completely meaningless and pissing in the wind. We need test and trace. Without door-to-door test and trace, without but like Vietnam and the only countries, what are the countries that have got on top of this, right? China, Vietnam, Cuba, a lot of East Asian countries, some Eastern European countries. Now, of course, some of that is because people aren't, and they're not as globalized as London, Paris, New York. Fine. But generally speaking, the countries that have done well is they've closed their borders and they've had extensive, very labor-intensive, not technologically advanced test and trace. I still, the fact that we've got people traveling is crazy. Or if you're going to travel, you have to go into a state-administered system of quarantine. The whole thing of self-quarantining, because again, people don't get it. This guy who was in Bolton went abroad. He came back. He was asymptomatic. He goes on a pub crawl. He thinks he's fine. He thinks, well, I'm not sick, so how can I have it? And we can't expect 65 million people to all have a PhD in epidemiology, right? So we have to have extensive test and trace. It has to be 10 times bigger than it presently is. And I think ultimately, by the way, mark my words, I think in 3 to 6 months, and you said it, I think, at the beginning of the week, yes, we'll have 500,000 or 1 million tests a day. Fine. If we do that, this is all academic. If we don't, we're going to have door-to-door test and trace.
Yeah, I buy that. I mean, although, as I say, everyone says let's have more testing. As you say, those countries who have managed it isn't necessarily by doing more testing than us. It's that they've had a control on the virus earlier by not sort of trying to keep the economy moving, even when it seems like the obviously dumb thing to do. Like the Kiwis in New Zealand, they don't actually have more tests than us because it's quite difficult to have more tests than us at this point in time. But because they took the early action when they needed to take it, they don't have to sort of make these sort of superhuman progress when it comes to test and trace now that the cat's been let out of the bag. We're going to go on to our final story for the evening. It's going to be a slightly shorter show than usual today, but that's nice for Friday. Means you can go and get pissed until you get kicked out of the pub at 10 p.m. Since Keir Starmer became Labour leader, 2 high-profile left-wing frontbenchers have been forced to resign because of things they had tweeted or said in the past. This week, however, was the first time frontbenchers were sacked for rebelling in the House of Commons. MPs Nadia Whittome, Olivia Blake and Beth Winter are all Socialist Campaign Group MPs who were elected for the first time in 2019. On Wednesday evening, they lost their position on the front bench for voting against a bill which, according to Labour's Shadow Defence Minister, creates the risk that the very grave crimes, including torture and other war crimes, go unpunished. Right? So this is the official Labour position is that this is a terrible law. You had some left-wing frontbenchers vote against this terrible law, and they've been sacked for doing so. So Labour MPs were whipped to abstain. As I say, Whittome, Blake and Winter voted against. On Peston, so Robert Peston's show, immediately after that vote, Whittome discovered she'd been fired live on air and explained why she voted in the way she did.
So I better find out from you, Nadia, whether you have indeed resigned. Because I think you're the PPS on the health team, aren't you? And
I am, and I haven't resigned.
You haven't resigned?
I haven't resigned.
And are you expecting to be asked to resign? Because you did vote against, because as I understand it, on this bill, the whip was that you should all abstain, but you voted with Jeremy Corbyn against this bill.
The one-line whip to abstain. I thought that the bill was a matter of conscience. I understand why colleagues came to a different conclusion and thought that we can amend this at committee stage. That's perfectly reasonable. But I felt that given that all the major human rights organisations, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and given that even the British Legion and veterans themselves oppose this bill, and these are all arguments that our front bench made today. We don't agree with this bill, and we think it's anti-veteran, it's anti-human rights. It would effectively decriminalise torture, and that's why I voted against it.
So, I mean, there's a bunch of things to say here. Unfortunately, when it comes to a one-line whip, Nadia Whittome wasn't quite correct there. I mean, if it is the rules convention that a one-line whip means that if you vote against the party whip, you do have to resign your position. So a one-line whip means you don't have to turn up if you don't want to, but if you do turn up, you have to vote with the party. So because it was a bill where the government or the Labour Party said you have to abstain on this. If you didn't turn up, you were fine. If you voted for or against, you would have to resign if you were on the front bench. So in terms of sort of like the formal conventions, it's understandable that Nadia had to resign. The problem is why the whip was to abstain in the first place when you have a party which has very proactively said, this is a terrible bill. This is a terrible law that people are voting for. And after I found out quite late in the evening, actually, that after I sort of looked through Nadia resigning, etc., I was sort of like, oh, well, it seems like a brave position to take, but she's rebelled against Keir Starmer and the official Labour front bench position. Then I looked at this tweet from the Labour Party, which agrees with Nadia Whittome. So this is a tweet from Labour just after the bill was voted on. So they write, the Tories just voted for a bill that puts our troops at risk. Labour will fight to protect our armed forces and their right to justice. It says the Overseas Operations Bill could reduce protections for our brave service personnel. So you've got the Labour Party tweeting out, the Tories just voted for this terrible bill, trying to get political capital out of the fact that the Tories voted for this. So, but you didn't vote against it. And your MPs that did vote against it had to resign because you told them to abstain on a bill which you vociferously disagree with and argues puts our troops in danger, argues allows us to, well, essentially legalize torture. The whole thing just seems completely bizarre. From a moral level, obviously the Labour Party should be voting against the Overseas Operations Bill because it introduces a statute of limitations for 5 years for crimes committed overseas by British military personnel. Obviously, a crime committed 6 years ago, especially if it's torture or a war crime, is still a crime. Those people still need to be tried. Justice still needs to be done. But yeah, the Labour Party have decided to abstain because of, I think it's because Keir Starmer doesn't want to be hammered on patriotism. It is, I saw people say, which is exactly right. If you believe in the possibility of progressive patriotism, you can't then assume that the only way you can get patriotic people to vote for you is to try and legalize torture. I mean, it's not a particularly imaginative vision of what Britain is, and it's a very negative one. But anyway, yeah, Labour say this is a terrible bill, then they vote against it, then they sack people who, then they abstain on it, then they sack people who vote against it. I mean, to me, as well as being morally cowardly, I suppose, Aaron, it's also really bizarre optics.
Look, Labour are going to vote against this on the third reading. Oh, well, we're not in 2017 to 2019 anymore. Oh, well, they'll abstain and then, they'll be able to get some amendments. No, the Tories have a majority of 80. You're not going to get any amendments, right? You will occasionally, for instance, with the NHS stuff, at the height of the COVID crisis, but on foreign and security policy, on a totemic culture wars issue, which is so important for the right, you're not going to get anything through. So why bother? And like you say, they just sacked a promising, honourable young MP for agreeing with their own Twitter feed. And I think it does. I think you're right on here. It really does. I think there is I think that the idea of progressive patriotism, I don't think it's a particularly overwhelmingly clear. It doesn't, send me into raptures. I can see how it might be philosophically coherent for somebody. But like you say, you can't say, oh, I'm a progressive patriot and I'm going to allow effectively somebody who commits torture to get away with it if, it happened more than 5 years ago, which, by the way, and I did an interview with a guy, Ian Cobain, earlier this summer, who's written a great book about the use of torture by Britain's armed forces, police, etc. Cruel Britannia. This basically would have meant that you couldn't have seen prosecutions against people who executed forms of torture in Kenya, Malaya, Ireland, Cyprus, Aden. There's so many. So you're looking at multiple theatres of war. There are stories of people. The great book by a lady called Carol Elkins. Thousands of people were physically mutilated in Kenya, testicles taken apart, losing arms, tortured to death. This is not being made up. And by the way, another great book by Ian Cobain, about basically the disappearance of, the secret state and the disappearance of files relating to what happened in Kenya and many other places. They just sort of destroyed en masse when Britain fly out of these places for the last time and finally concede independence to places like Kenya or Malawi and so on. None of the people who did that would have been found guilty of war crimes or torture. And Labour abstained on this. Right? They abstained on it. And I think serious questions have to be asked. I'm not going anywhere. I'm a Labour Party member. But I can understand why somebody with a sense of ethics says, I do not want to be a part of this. And okay, you could say, well, it was about, it's playing politics to X, Y, Z. Given we're in a world of an 80 majority for the Tories, that isn't going to happen. All abstaining does is it strengthens the Tories' arms. That's all it does. It gives so much legitimacy to what is, in all reality, according to the Royal Legion, according to Amnesty International, according to Human Rights Watch, a barbaric piece of legislation. Why would you concede that? You know, imagine if Corbyn says, you know, I want to build a giant new city and we're going to call it Corbyngrad, 20 miles out of London. And the Tories go, we're going to abstain. You go, whoa, really? Yeah, it's all going to have brutalist architecture and everything's going to be free. You know, the Corbynite base would love it. And the Tories go, we're going to be really clever and abstain. Why would you do that? What next? The Labour going to abstain on fox hunting? And people go, this is Starmer being really clever. So basically what you're saying is clever politics. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe people can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. Clever politics now, if you're in Labour, you know, a really keen person who loves Keir Starmer, clever politics is giving the Tories an open door on foreign and security policy. Now the Tories can say, we want to, and by the way, this is effectively happening, right? That they're now proposing new forms of legislation that basically MI5, MI6, they're allowed to now break the law. That's now what's being posed as legislation. Are Labour going to push back on that? You know, or we're going to have, you know, involuntary detention or extraordinary rendition. The Tories could just throw all this at Labour, and are they just going to abstain? You know, and what's remarkable is the bleating from the moderates and the Labour centre about international law, right, or the single market. And yet, like, oh no, okay, well, we'll effectively go soft and quasi-legalise the use of torture by armed forces. That's fine. I mean, you know, again, it's like, you know, internationalism minus anti-imperialism is a very, very, very weak politics.
I mean, one way of looking at it in terms of the, you know, the bleating about international law is what is an international law which we should be more defensive of, the Withdrawal Agreement or the Geneva Convention? Right, because for me, the Geneva Convention saying torture should not be done is way more important than the one which says that, well, I mean, to be honest, I think that we should have a soft border on the island of Ireland because of the Good Friday Agreement. But in any case, the Geneva Convention, a much more fundamental principle than the Withdrawal Agreement. And I think the fact that we now have a Labour Party which is pretending otherwise just seems self-defeating. And I can see, I mean, you know, obviously, I don't think they're abstaining because they think they can bring about amendments at a later stage. They're abstaining because they don't want to have a row about this, because understandably they want to keep the debate on coronavirus and they want to keep the debate on the economy, etc., because that's the bread and butter issues that they think, one, the Tories are quite weak on, and two, that they feel like they can win the votes they need with. But the problem is, at least in this situation, I don't really expect them to be saying the number one issue at the moment is that we need to prosecute soldiers for crimes they did 6 years ago. But you can very easily stand up and say, look, this is a distraction from coronavirus. This is a distraction from the economic chaos and Rishi Sunak's feeble job support scheme. But it's also a ridiculous law which we cannot countenance voting for and we cannot countenance not opposing because, and then they use all the arguments they use, which is to say that this undermines sort of Britain's status in the world. You can use these patriotic arguments that, you know, Britain follows the rule of law, especially when it comes to war crimes, etc., etc. You can make a patriotic argument for not voting for this piece of shit legislation, and they decided to just leave the field, and now you have the Conservatives sending out emails anyway that says Labour have voted or refused to support a bill protecting our veterans. And because Labour aren't out on the airwaves sort of saying this has nothing to do with protecting our veterans, then they've sort of lost that argument before it's even started. They're in retreat before a battle has begun.
Well, okay, so here's a question. You don't think they've abstain because they think they can change the legislation. But so what, do you think they would have abstained on the third reading when it would have had a, you know, that would have been the big thing?
No, they'll vote against the third. I think they'll vote against the third reading. So
they've got to now, right? I mean,
well, it's the same as the, I mean, it's a parliamentary manoeuvre which is always just very ineffective, and I can't think of any example where it's actually worked. It's the same as with the welfare bill that Labour did. It's to say we will abstain on the second reading because we agree with the principle of the bill. We agree with what the government is saying needs to happen. So the government here is saying we need to protect veterans from vexatious claims of war crimes done decades ago. And so say we abstain because we agree with the principle, but we just think the contents of the law do not do that, or they have sort of side effects which we cannot support. So the official position is we agree with the principle, but we don't agree with the details. And that's what the Labour Party said on the welfare bill. We agree that welfare should be tighter and stricter on people who are not willing to go back to work, but we disagree with some of the details. I think in that case, it was the sort of the element of it that meant that you would lose benefits if you had more than 2 children. So you sort of say, the principle we're in favour of, it's the details which are the problem. But I mean, just by putting it like that, when has we agree with the principles, but the details of the problem ever worked as a political strategy or a political message? It's meaningless.
Also, the idea that, we're going to introduce this law so people can never be vexatiously charged on something. What? So, I mean, imagine sexual assault. There are people who are vexatiously charged with sexual assault, which never happened, right? It's a tiny minority. So if you're saying this can never, ever happen again, we can never have a vexatious claim of sexual assault or robbery or whatever, any particular crime, you're effectively saying, okay, well, the rule of law no longer applies. That's what you're effectively saying. That's why we have due process. That's why we have law, to be able to arbitrate what happened or not, what's true and false. That's the whole point of the process. And you're saying, actually, just remove it, which is effectively saying this is now no longer subject to the rule of law. And another thing, the same people that go, oh, well, who think this is fine, who think effectively we can, it is tacitly accepting, torture if it's more than 5 years ago. The same people who say, Britain would never use torture abroad. But this is not, I don't even have to go particularly far back. I think it was Camp Sebastian, it may or may not be. There are British officers on record about the use of torture in Iraq. We don't need to go back 50 years, by the way, even to Kenya or to Aden or to Cyprus. We don't need to do that, or to Malaya. Iraq. It was used in Iraq. It was used in Ireland as recently as the early 1990s, late 1980s. So again, the Ian Cobain book, I can't recommend it enough. And I just think, what's the shtick here with Keir Starmer? We've been talking about it in our personal conversations over the week, Well, the one thing I thought this guy would be is a social liberal. That's the one thing I thought he would be, right? But what happens tomorrow and we've seen it a little bit with the GRA, by the way. Labour have really just avoided that like the plague. What if there was I'm starting to think maybe David Cameron was more of a social, because David Cameron had terrible politics in the economy, but he was a social liberal, right? He took the Tories in a direction on, for instance, on gay marriage they never would have gone down. Maybe David Cameron is more socially liberal than Keir Starmer. Maybe or let me put that another way. Maybe David Cameron wanted his leadership of the Conservative Party to instantiate socially liberal politics more than Keir Starmer does for Labour. Maybe Starmer wants to go to his right when it comes to socially conservative values. And I think that's highly plausible, by the way. I think that's highly, highly plausible. And for a party that's full of socialists, social liberals, social democrats, that should be really concerning. Because Labour, people go, Labour's the party of Attlee and Keir Hardie. Yeah, it's also, it's also the party of Roy Jenkins. Getting rid of hanging, capital punishment, corporal punishment, allowing divorce. That's also Labour's legacy. So if they're just going to allow the whole field of law and order, the military, and just give it to the Conservatives, but, this is what Attlee would have done. No, it's not. It's really not. By the way, and Attlee did a bunch of terrible things. We've talked about them because of the empire and so on. But rhetorically, they were very much for internationalist, universalist, multilateral, rule of order based institutions like the UN, for instance. Right? Again, they always bang on about NATO. They never bang on about the UN because NATO is a military alliance. The UN actually might impose constraints on powerful countries abroad. So I think it's cause for concern. Even more concerning is the kind of the dupes who are dressing it up as sort of a clever political gambit, because it certainly isn't that. It's selling out, plain and simple.
And who should be able to explain why this is a bad law is why you don't need to give people blanket immunity to stop vexatious prosecutions from happening would be the former director of public prosecutions. I can see why. Obviously, Jeremy Corbyn would not have abstained on this, but I can see why when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, this would have been a difficult subject, because they said, the only reason you don't want to support this law is because you support the vexatious claims made against British soldiers. It's because you back the IRA. It's because you actually hate the British armed forces and you're a terrorist sympathiser, etc., etc. Obviously, he still should not have abstained, and he would not have abstained. He would have voted against it, but it would have come with political costs. Whereas for Keir Starmer, when they say, you're only doing this because you're a terrorist sympathiser, I prosecute terrorists. You're only doing this because you want vexatious prosecutions to happen. It's like, my job was literally to adjudicate between proper prosecutions and vexatious prosecutions. And I can see, as the person who was literally in charge of all of this, that this is a distraction, that this is a political ploy, and it is not going to protect any soldier. All it's going to do is start a silly distraction, which the Conservatives are desperate to have because they failed on coronavirus and they failed on jobs. I mean, It's not that difficult. And if you have a knighthood, you're Sir Keir Starmer. You're exactly the kind of person who doesn't have to concede these things to the Conservatives, because you should have the, that sort of British patriotic stature where people do have a deference to authority. So you might as well use that authority, because there's no point in, I didn't vote for Sir Keir Starmer, but the only argument that I saw that was a good one for voting for Sir Keir Starmer is that if you want to have a policy which, can protect human rights and can sort of resist the kind of culture war attacks that you'll get from the Conservatives, it's someone who looks as establishment as you can get, who looks as patriotic as you can get, who looks as law and order as you can get. And the Director of Public Prosecutions, who has a knighthood, is that. But it only works if he's willing to use that to fight for good causes, to fight for what's right. Otherwise, it's pointless. You've just elected as establishment person to agree with anything the establishment says, which, kind of does look like what we're facing at the moment. I'm going to end with a question from the audience. Darren Alevi with a $5. Any possibility someone will challenge Starmer's leadership anytime soon? I can probably guess your answer, but I'll throw that to you, Aaron.
Well, let's see, because people are talking him up as a prime minister. We've not had a single by-election. We've not had a single set of elections. Right now, the whole genre of politics in an era of COVID suits them down to the ground. It's all about TV interviews and polls. Nothing's actually happening. There are no protests. The actual idea of everyday people getting involved in political life, whether it's at the ballot box or activism, it's kind of on ice, right? And so that's not how the real world works. I don't think Starmer's going to be the prime minister. And I'll tell you a very, very simple reason why. He's taking the difficult choices against ultimately a very weak and fragile left, right? It's ridiculously weak. Its parliamentary representation is generally impotent. Its social base can't even go outside because we've got a pandemic. He's taking the tough choices against them. And when it comes to the tough choices against the Conservatives, saying, actually, I don't think this bill does look after veterans. I don't think it is in any way upholding the kind of values we want as a country. I don't think he'll win. The structural objective challenges facing Labour are so significant. He's going to have to make some difficult decisions going the other way too. And this only really hit me a couple of days ago with the speech. Because like you say, everything right now is on COVID. Everybody's talking about COVID. Everybody's talking about the high streets and the economy and, all these poor, as we start the show, these poor young people having to self-isolate in Glasgow. Everybody's talking about it. And Keir Starmer, for 2 days, in his speech, right? In his speech, he decided to take the political conversation away from COVID and the economy to talking about the Labour Party. Why would you do that? Why would you do that, right? On an issue where he should be setting the agenda on the rule of law, and like you say, saying, well, actually, if he does believe in this progressive patriotism shtick, explaining it to the country, the story has become, oh, wow, he sacked this really principled young woman, right? Again, why would you do that? It seems like really poor political management. And so I don't trust people who only take tough decisions against people that are weaker than them, but refuse to do so against those that are stronger than them. I think that tells you something very important about the principles of somebody and the backbone of somebody. And I don't think somebody with a backbone behaves like that. We'll see.
I think that's a very good principle to guide you, actually. Don't trust people who only take tough decisions against people who are politically weaker than them. I like that. That's going to stick with me. We are going to leave it there. Just a couple of super chats. First, Lou Radford with a $5. Enjoying the show tonight. Keep it up. Thank you, Lou. Ben Pritchard with $5 New Zealand dollars, is it? I think it's dollars. Well done. Keep up the informative journalism all the way over to New Zealand. Love your work. Thank you so much, Ben Pritchard. And thank you so much for everyone for watching TyskySour this evening and for your kind support both in the super chats and on our website. As you know, TyskySour and Novara Media is only possible because of your donations. If you already donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, thank you very much. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back on Monday at 7 p.m. Same time, same place. You've been watching TyskySour on Novara Media. Good night.